What if the one destined to clear your name is the one you're fated to either save or destroy? Tonight, we dive into a world where loyalty is a weapon, love is a battlefield, and the truth you're searching for might be the very thing that destroys everything you once believed. Nora was the pack's most trusted tracker, until mysterious deaths across their territory made her the perfect scapegoat. Stripped of her rank, cast out in disgrace, she's offered an impossible choice by an enemy alpha. Help him expose the real traitor, or watch innocent lives burn for crimes she didn't commit. But in a world where wolves can smell lies and feel the heartbeat of deception, some truths cut deeper than silver, and some alliances forge bonds that transcend pack loyalty. This is a story of broken trust, forbidden attraction, and the deadly price of redemption. If you're ready to feel every heartbeat, every betrayal, every impossible choice that could save or damn them all, hit subscribe and let the story begin. The scent hit Nora before she saw him. Pine smoke and winter rain, with an undercurrent of something dangerous that made her wolf stir restlessly beneath her skin. 3 weeks of living as a rogue had taught her to trust her instincts above all else, and every instinct screamed that Alpha Jackson shouldn't be here, shouldn't know where to find her, and definitely shouldn't be holding something that made her heart race with equal parts hope and terror. "You look like hell, Nora Thorne." His voice carried that distinctive alpha resonance that could make even strong wolves submit. But there was something else there, genuine concern masked by calculated indifference. She remained crouched by the stream where she'd been washing the blood of her latest hunt from her hands, muscles coiled to flee. "Trust no one," she reminded herself. "Especially not the enemy of your enemy." Jackson stepped closer, moonlight catching the angular planes of his face, revealing eyes that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed walls. "I have something that belongs to you. Something that proves you were never the problem." He held up a small glass vial filled with liquid that gleamed an unnatural green under the starlight. The sight of it made her stomach clench with recognition. She'd smelled that acrid chemical tang in the places where animals had died, where her territory had started to rot from the inside out. "That's..." Her voice came out rougher than intended, months of rarely speaking aloud evident in its hoarseness. She forced herself to stand, to meet his gaze even though her wolf wanted to bare its throat to his alpha presence. "Where did you find that?" The question carried the weight of desperation she'd been carrying since Derek's pronouncement of guilt, since the pack's collective howl of rejection had echoed through the sacred circle and left her more alone than she'd ever imagined possible. "Buried along your southern border, exactly where someone wanted it to stay hidden." Jackson's smile held no warmth, only the promise of revelations that would reshape everything she thought she knew. "But here's what's really interesting, little wolf. This wasn't meant to kill the animals. It was meant to be found, eventually. Someone wanted your pack to discover the contamination, wanted Derek to have a scapegoat." He paused, letting the implications sink in like poison in her veins. "The question is, are you ready to learn who's been playing puppet master with your life?" The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, ancient trees leaning inward as if eager to witness this moment, when everything would begin to unravel. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that accepting his help would mean trusting the one alpha who had every reason to want her pack destroyed, and that refusing might mean letting the real traitor continue their deadly game unopposed. The abandoned hunting cabin reeked of old fear and older secrets, its walls scarred by claw marks that told stories of desperate wolves who'd sheltered here long before territorial disputes made such places forbidden. Jackson moved through the space like he owned it, lighting candles with practiced ease while Nora remained near the door, every muscle screaming at her to run, even as her mind cataloged the evidence spread across the rough-hewn table. "Synthetic wolfsbane mixed with industrial pesticides," he said, his tone clinical despite the way his shoulders remained tensed for violence. 12 injection sites forming a perfect geometric pattern across your territory's hunting grounds. Whoever did this wanted maximum psychological impact. Make the deaths visible. Make them inexplicable. Make your alpha question everything he thought he knew about his pack's competence. Nora approached the table slowly, her enhanced senses cataloging each piece of evidence with forensic precision. Maps marked with red X's, soil samples in labeled containers, photographs that made her stomach turn. Derek knew, she realized with a cold, that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the cabin's gaps. "This report is dated 3 weeks before he accused me." Her voice carried the hollowness of betrayal, the sound of trust cracking like ice under pressure. Your Alpha received a full briefing on the contamination, complete with geographical analysis and chemical composition. Jackson's eyes never left her face, reading her reactions like a predator assessing prey. He knew someone was sabotaging your territory, knew it wasn't natural causes or tracker incompetence, and he still let you take the blame. The words hit like physical blows, each one reshaping her understanding of the man she'd served with absolute loyalty for 6 years. She sank into the cabin's single chair, wood creaking under her weight as the full scope of her situation crashed over her. He knew. Derek knew I wasn't responsible, and he destroyed me anyway. Why? The word escaped as barely more than breath. Why would he sacrifice me if he had proof of sabotage? But even as she asked, part of her already suspected the answer. Derek had needed a scapegoat more than he'd needed the truth. Jackson moved to stand directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes, smell the complex layers of his scent. Because, little wolf, whoever's really behind this has something on your Alpha, something worth more to him than one tracker's life. His hand lifted as if to touch her face, then stopped, falling back to his side. The question now is whether you want revenge or justice. The candle flames flickered in the silence that followed, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of choices that could never be undone and alliances that would reshape the balance of power between packs forever. The silver locket felt heavier than sin in Nora's palm, its delicate chain still warm from whatever hand had worn it recently. She'd found it buried beneath layers of rotting leaves at the contamination site, almost as if it had been placed there for her to discover. The engraved initials made her chest tight. L.M. Lydia Meadows, her childhood friend, her confidant, her sister in everything but blood. You recognize it. Jackson's voice cut through the rushing sound of her pulse in her ears, gentle but relentless. They were crouched beside the stream that marked the disputed border, ice-cold water carrying away the scent of poison and betrayal. Tell me about her. It wasn't really a request. Alphas rarely asked for things they could command, but there was something in his tone that made it feel like a choice. Promise me we'll always be sisters, no matter what. Lydia's 12-year-old voice echoed from memories that now felt sharp enough to cut. Nora closed her eyes, letting herself fall into the past despite every instinct warning her against vulnerability. She was my anchor, she whispered, the words carrying 20 years of shared secrets. When my parents died in the territorial raid, Lydia's family took me in. She taught me to track, helped me train, stood by me when Derek chose me as lead tracker over wolves twice my age. The locket seemed to burn against her skin as more memories surfaced. Lydia insisting on mapping the southern territories herself. Lydia suggesting Nora take point on the contamination investigation. Lydia's concerned questions that had always come just before problems arose. How long has she been watching me fail? The thought tasted like copper and ash. She had access to all your patrol routes, all your reports to Derek. Jackson's words were surgical in their precision, cutting away the illusions Nora had built her world around. She knew exactly where you'd be investigating, exactly what you'd find and when you'd find it. Perfect positioning to stay one step ahead of your discoveries. He paused, studying her face with unsettling intensity. The question is whether she's the mastermind or just another pawn being moved around the board. Nora forced herself to open her eyes, to meet his gaze despite the tears that blurred her vision. 20 years of friendship, 20 years of trust. Her voice cracked on the words, but she pushed through the pain. If Lydia could betray me, then nothing I believed about loyalty or family or pack bonds means anything. How do I know you're not doing the same thing? How do I know this isn't just another manipulation? Something shifted in Jackson's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. Because, little wolf, he said, his voice dropping to something almost tender. If I wanted to destroy you, I wouldn't need elaborate schemes. I'd just let Derek finish what he started. The brutal honesty of it hit like a slap, but there was something underneath the words that made her wolf settle slightly. Truth, perhaps, or at least the absence of deception. The USB drive felt like a weapon in Marcus's scarred hands, its black plastic surface seeming to absorb the weak afternoon light, filtering through the abandoned warehouse's grimy windows. Derek's most loyal enforcer looked like he'd aged a decade in the weeks since Nora's banishment. His usually perfect military posture bent under the weight of secrets that were eating him alive from the inside. "I've been recording conversations for 3 months," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, despite the soundproofing Jackson had confirmed surrounded their meeting place. "Started when things with Lydia stopped making sense, when her suggestions kept leading to more problems instead of solutions." His eyes, once bright with the certainty of absolute loyalty, now held the hollow look of a man whose faith had been systematically dismantled. Nora sat across from him on a crate of abandoned engine parts, her enhanced hearing picking up the rapid staccato of his heartbeat, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of nerves stretched to their breaking point. Marcus has never doubted Derek. If he's questioning orders now, things are worse than I imagined. "What changed?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle despite the urgency clawing at her chest. "The night Derek decided to banish you." Marcus's gaze dropped to the floor, shame radiating from him in waves. "Lydia came to him with evidence of your negligence, but something about her scent was off. Too controlled, too calculated. Wolves don't smell like that when they're genuinely concerned about pack safety." He looked up, meeting her eyes with visible effort. "I started following her after that, documenting her movements, her meetings. What I found..." He shook his head, the gesture carrying years of disillusionment. Jackson moved closer, his presence both protective and possessive in a way that made Nora's skin tingle with unwanted awareness. "Play it," he commanded, his alpha voice leaving no room for hesitation. Marcus connected the drive to a small digital player, the device's tiny speaker filling the warehouse with the sound of familiar voices discussing her fate, like she was already dead. "The contamination is spreading faster than we anticipated." Lydia's voice, but wrong somehow. Too measured, missing the warmth that had characterized 20 years of friendship. "Nora's incompetence has put the entire pack at risk. We need to act decisively before she causes more damage." Then Derek's response, heavy with reluctance. "She's been loyal for 6 years, Lydia. There has to be another explanation." And finally, the words that shattered what remained of Nora's illusions. "Loyalty doesn't matter when wolves are dying, Derek. Sometimes leaders have to make the hard choices." The silence that followed felt thick enough to drown in. Nora stared at the device as if it might somehow take back the words it had just played, as if she could unhear the cold calculation in her best friend's voice discussing her destruction like a necessary business transaction. "She never loved me. 20 years of sisterhood, and it was all just..." What? Preparation for this moment? The recording that changed everything lasted exactly 47 seconds, but those seconds contained enough revelations to reshape the political landscape of 3 territories. Nora listened to it 4 times, each playthrough revealing new layers of conspiracy that made her stomach churn with the implications. Lydia's voice, discussing the timeline for territorial integration and neutralizing remaining opposition elements with someone whose identity the poor audio quality obscured, but whose authority was unmistakable. "She's not the leader," Nora whispered, the realization hitting her like ice water in her veins. "Lydia's taking orders from someone else, someone with enough power to promise her things worth betraying her family for." She looked up at Jackson, seeing her own suspicions reflected in his carefully controlled expression. If Lydia isn't the mastermind, then who is? And how deep does this conspiracy go? Marcus leaned forward, his scarred hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "There's more. Financial records I managed to access before my clearance got restricted. Someone's been funneling money through shell companies, funding what looks like a coordinated campaign against smaller packs across the entire region." His voice carried the weight of a man confessing sins that weren't entirely his own. "Derek isn't the only alpha being manipulated. This is bigger than territorial disputes. Someone's systematically destabilizing the traditional pack structure." The implications hit Nora like a physical blow, making her grateful for the solid weight of the crate beneath her. "This isn't about me. It was never about me. I was just collateral damage in something much larger." "How many packs?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "How many other alphas are being fed false information, pressured into making decisions that serve someone else's agenda?" "At least 7 that I can confirm," Marcus replied, his voice hollow with the scope of the conspiracy. "Maybe more. The pattern is always the same. Identify the most competent and loyal pack members, then manufacture evidence of their incompetence or betrayal. Remove the people who might notice inconsistencies. Replace them with individuals who are either compromised or completely loyal to the new order." Jackson moved to the grimy window, his posture radiating tension as he scanned the industrial landscape beyond. When he spoke, his voice carried an edge of something that might have been fear if alphas were capable of such vulnerability. My sister was investigating financial irregularities in our territory when she died. The accident that killed her happened the night before she was supposed to present evidence to the Pack Council. He turned back to face them, and Nora saw something raw and dangerous in his expression. I think she discovered the same conspiracy you're uncovering now. The warehouse seemed to shrink around them as the full scope of their situation became clear. They weren't just dealing with territorial politics or personal vendettas. They were facing an organized effort to remake the entire supernatural political landscape, and everyone who got too close to the truth ended up dead or discredited. How do you fight an enemy you can't identify, with resources you can't trace, who's already eliminated everyone else who posed a threat? The ancient stone circle where Derek held pack meetings felt different under the cover of darkness, older, somehow, and heavy with the weight of secrets that predated the current territorial disputes by centuries. Nora crouched in the tree line beyond the sacred ground, her enhanced vision picking out details that daylight visits had never revealed, symbols carved into the standing stones that weren't pack markers, but something far older and more sinister. Those aren't traditional wolf markings, Jackson breathed beside her, his body close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, smell the complex layers of his scent that her wolf was beginning to recognize as safe, despite every rational argument against trust. Those symbols, I've seen them before, in my father's old journals, the ones he kept about the territory wars 40 years ago. Nora's breath caught as the implications crystallized. 40 years ago. Before Derek became Alpha. Before most of the current pack structure was established. Someone's been planning this for decades, she whispered, the words carrying a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This isn't opportunistic political maneuvering. It's a generational conspiracy. The thought made her skin crawl with the realization of how thoroughly they'd all been manipulated. Through the gloom, she watched a familiar figure emerge from the forest on the opposite side of the circle. Aldrich Greystone, the pack's eldest council member and Derek's most trusted advisor, moved with purpose toward the central altar stone. At 73, he should have been showing signs of the stiffness that came with age, but his movements carried the fluid grace of someone decades younger. How did I never notice that before? He's not alone, Jackson murmured, his hand finding her shoulder in a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. Two more figures materialized from the shadows. Lydia, her posture subservient in a way that made Nora's chest ache with the death of 20 years of friendship, and someone else whose scent carried an artificial quality that set Nora's teeth on edge. A wolf, but wrong somehow, like the natural musk had been chemically altered to mask identity. The conversation that followed was conducted in voices too low for normal hearing, but Nora's enhanced senses caught every word with crystalline clarity. The Thorn situation has been neutralized, but the Constantine Alpha is becoming problematic, Aldrich said, his tone carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to orchestrating lives from the shadows. His investigation into his sister's death is attracting attention we can't afford. Lydia's response made Nora's heart clench with betrayal that felt fresh despite days of evidence. Should we eliminate him the same way we handled the sister? Make it look like territorial violence? The casual discussion of murder, spoken in the voice that had once whispered childhood secrets and sworn eternal loyalty, nearly broke something fundamental in Nora's chest. She's not just following orders. She's enthusiastic about the violence. Not yet, the third figure interjected, and Nora's blood turned to ice as she recognized the voice beneath the chemical masking. Jackson Constantine serves our purposes better alive for now. Let him discover just enough truth to feel like he's making progress, then use his investigation to eliminate any remaining loose ends. The speaker turned slightly, moonlight revealing features that had been hidden by artificial shadows, including his new tracker friend, when the time comes. The safe house Jackson had prepared felt more like a fortress than a refuge, its reinforced walls and multiple exit routes speaking to paranoia born of experience rather than natural caution. Nora sat at the central table surrounded by evidence that painted a picture of conspiracy so vast, it made her previous understanding of pack politics seem childishly naive. Maps covered in red ink showed a web of influence that stretched across 12 territories, with financial records documenting the systematic purchase of loyalty among key pack members. Aldrich Greystone, she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth as she stared at a photograph from Derek's inauguration ceremony 6 years ago. The elderly wolf stood at Derek's right hand, his expression carrying the satisfied look of a puppet master watching his carefully orchestrated performance. He's been Derek's advisor since before I joined the pack. Hell, he probably influenced Derek's decision to make me lead tracker in the first place. Jackson paced the length of the room like a caged predator, his restless energy making the air itself feel charged with tension. My father's journals mention Greystone going back to the territorial wars. He was supposedly a minor pack member then, barely worth noting. He stopped abruptly, turning to face her with eyes that glowed gold in the lamplight. But what if that was the point? What if being underestimated was always part of his strategy? The implications made Nora's head spin with the scope of the deception. A 40-year plan to reshape pack politics. How many alphas has he influenced? How many loyal wolves has he destroyed to clear his path? The chemical scent masking on the third conspirator, she said, pieces clicking together with horrifying clarity. That's not just about hiding identity, it's about hiding species. What if Greystone isn't working alone? What if he's been compromised by something outside the pack structure entirely? Before Jackson could respond, the secure phone Marcus had given them buzzed with an incoming message. The text was brief, but carried enough urgency to make Nora's pulse spike. Meeting moved up. They know about Constantine investigation. 48 hours to eliminate all loose ends. M. Below it, GPS coordinates for a location deep in neutral territory, and a timestamp indicating the meeting would happen in less than 6 hours. It's a trap, Jackson said, but his voice carried resignation rather than surprise. They're using Marcus to flush us out. Probably have been monitoring his communications since he first made contact. He moved to the weapons cabinet, his movements economical and deadly. The question is whether we spring the trap on our terms or let them dictate the engagement. Nora stood slowly, her body already preparing for the violence she could smell approaching like a storm front. We're running out of time, out of options, out of allies. There's a third option, she said, her voice carrying a steadiness that surprised her. We don't go to their meeting. We go straight to the source. She gestured at the photograph of Aldrich, her finger tracing the edges of his deceptively grandfatherly features. If he's been planning this for 40 years, he'll have contingencies for discovery, but he won't expect a direct assault on his position. The silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility and catastrophe in equal measure. Outside, wind rattled the reinforced windows like skeletal fingers seeking entry, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled with the lonely sound of a creature calling to something that would never answer. We're about to start a war, Nora realized. The only question is whether we'll survive long enough to finish it. The leather-bound journal cracked like breaking bones when Jackson opened it, the yellowed pages releasing the scent of old paper and older secrets into the safe house's recycled air. Nora leaned closer despite herself, drawn by the meticulous handwriting that chronicled events from before her birth, from a time when the current pack structures were just forming, and the balance of power hung on the edge of violence. Year 23, month 7. Greystone's influence over the young Derek grows stronger daily. The boy sees him as a father figure, never questioning advice that consistently weakens traditional pack bonds, while strengthening hierarchical control. I fear we are witnessing the careful cultivation of a puppet regime. Jackson's father had possessed the foresight to document his suspicions, but apparently lacked the political power to act on them. Your father knew, Nora whispered, her finger tracing the elegant script that detailed meeting after meeting, where Greystone had slowly, systematically undermined Derek's natural instincts for collaborative leadership. He saw the manipulation happening and tried to warn people. The next entry made her blood run cold. Greystone has begun asking detailed questions about pack bloodlines, particularly those with enhanced tracking abilities. His interest in genealogy seems focused on identifying wolves with specific genetic markers. Jackson's jaw clenched with visible effort at emotional control. 3 months after he wrote that entry, my father died in what was ruled a training accident. A tree fell on him during a routine border patrol, a tree that showed clear evidence of tool marks at the base, but the investigation was ruled inconclusive due to environmental factors. His voice carried decades of buried grief and rage. Greystone offered to help with the funeral arrangements personally. So fucking generous of him. The pattern was becoming clear with sickening inevitability. Anyone who gets too close to the truth dies in accidents. Anyone who might expose the conspiracy suffers mysterious failures that destroy their credibility. He's been systematically eliminating threats for 40 years, Nora said, the words feeling like stones in her throat. Building his network, placing his people, removing obstacles. She flipped through more pages, finding entry after entry documenting Greystone's slow ascension to unofficial power behind multiple alpha thrones. A loose photograph fell from between the journal's pages, landing face up on the table between them. The image showed a group of wolves in human form gathered around what looked like a ritual circle, but the symbols carved into the stone weren't from any pack tradition Nora recognized. At the center of the group stood a younger Aldrich Greystone, his hands raised in what appeared to be a ceremonial gesture, while around him wolves knelt in positions of submission that spoke to power dynamics completely outside normal pack hierarchy. "That's not a pack meeting," Jackson said, his voice tight with recognition and revulsion. "That's a binding ritual. But binding to what?" He pointed to symbols etched into the stone that seemed to writhe and shift in the photograph's poor lighting. "My father wrote about rumors of old magic, pre-pack societies that used wolves as vessels for something else, something that required absolute loyalty and the complete surrender of individual will." The temperature in the room seemed to drop as understanding crystallized. Not just political manipulation, supernatural influence, something that's been wearing Greystone's face for decades while slowly corrupting everything it touches. "The chemical scent masking," Nora said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not hiding identity. It's hiding the fact that whatever's controlling these people isn't entirely wolf anymore." The abandoned industrial complex where Marcus had arranged their meeting reeked of rust and old violence, its skeletal framework of broken conveyor belts and collapsed loading docks creating perfect ambush points for anyone with tactical experience and murderous intent. Nora moved through the shadows with predatory grace, her enhanced senses cataloging every scent, every sound, every shift in air pressure that might indicate hostile presence. "Something's wrong," she subvocalized into the throat mic Jackson had insisted they wear, her voice barely more than breath. "Marcus's scent is here, but it's off, stressed, and there's something else underneath it that makes my skin crawl." The industrial decay around them felt heavy with anticipation, like the building itself was holding its breath before violence erupted. Jackson's response crackled through her earpiece with static that spoke to interference from unknown sources. "Copy that. I'm counting at least 6 heat signatures positioned for crossfire. This isn't a meeting. It's an execution." His voice carried the cold calculation of an alpha preparing for war, but underneath it she could hear something that might have been fear for her safety. "Why does that make my chest warm even in the middle of a death trap?" The sound of footsteps on metal grating announced Marcus's arrival before his scent fully registered, but when Nora caught sight of him through the industrial maze, her heart clenched with sympathetic horror. Derek's most loyal enforcer looked like he'd been systematically broken and rebuilt, his usually perfect posture bent with exhaustion, and his eyes holding the hollow look of a man whose soul had been carved out with surgical precision. "They have my daughter," he said without preamble, when Nora emerged from concealment, his voice carrying the defeated tone of absolute surrender. "Greystone showed me pictures of Sarah at her university, timestamps from yesterday. Said if I didn't deliver you both, she'd disappear the same way Jackson's sister did." His hands shook as he spoke, the tremor of a proud man forced to betray everything he believed in. The admission hit Nora like a physical blow, not because of the betrayal, she'd suspected as much, but because of the casual cruelty it revealed, using a man's love for his child as a weapon. How many other wolves has Greystone leveraged into cooperation the same way? "Where is she, Marcus?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle despite the urgency clawing at her chest. "Do you know where they're holding her?" Before Marcus could respond, the lights that had been providing minimal illumination throughout the complex suddenly blazed to life, turning their concealment into exposure and their tactical advantage into a liability. Aldrich Greystone's voice echoed from speakers positioned throughout the building, amplified until it seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Welcome, Miss Thorne, Mr. Constantine. I trust you've enjoyed your investigation into matters that were never your concern." The temperature seemed to drop as shadows began moving with purpose through the industrial maze. Not wolves in human form, but something else entirely. Their movements carried a fluid grace that spoke to supernatural enhancement, and their scent, God, their scent is wrong. Like wolves, but corrupted somehow, poisoned from the inside out. Jackson, she whispered into her mic, her voice tight with the kind of fear that came from facing something fundamentally unnatural. Whatever Greystone's been doing to create loyalty, I don't think these are volunteers anymore. The confrontation began not with violence, but with revelation. As Aldrich Greystone emerged from the industrial shadows looking exactly like the grandfatherly pack elder he'd pretended to be for decades, except for his eyes, which now glowed with an inner light that spoke to power drawn from sources that predated civilization. Behind him walked creatures that had once been wolves, their movements too fluid, their scents too uniform, their expressions too empty of individual will. "You've been remarkably persistent, Miss Thorne," Greystone said, his voice carrying harmonics that made Nora's teeth ache and her wolf cower in instinctive terror. "Your tracking abilities are quite extraordinary, so extraordinary, in fact, that they pose a significant threat to operations that have been 40 years in the making." He gestured to the corrupted wolves flanking him, their synchronized movement speaking to a hive mind that made Nora's stomach churn. Jackson emerged from his own concealment with weapons drawn, but Nora could see the futility of conventional resistance against whatever supernatural force had turned pack loyalty into literal puppetry. "We're outgunned, outmanned, and fighting something that doesn't follow normal rules," she realized, her mind racing through tactical options that all led to the same conclusion. "This isn't a fight we can win through violence. The entity I serve has been patient, Miss Thorne. Patient and thorough." Greystone's smile held no warmth, only the satisfaction of a predator finally revealing its true nature. "Your enhanced abilities stem from bloodlines that trace back to the original pack bonds, when wolves served as vessels for forces far greater than individual consciousness. You represent a genetic throwback to a time when loyalty meant something more than simple obedience." The implications hit Nora like ice water in her veins. "My tracking abilities aren't just enhanced senses. They're supernatural inheritance from whatever created the first packs. You're saying I'm some kind of, genetic anomaly?" But even as she spoke, pieces were clicking together with horrifying clarity. Her unusual ability to sense deception, her instinctive understanding of pack dynamics, the way other wolves responded to her presence despite her relatively low official rank. "You're saying she's a vessel," Jackson snarled, his alpha authority radiating outward in waves that made even the corrupted wolves hesitate momentarily. "Something your entity can use to expand its influence." His positioning shifted subtly, placing himself between Nora and the primary threat, and she felt something warm and fierce unfurl in her chest, despite their desperate circumstances. Greystone's laugh carried the sound of breaking glass and dying hope. "Oh, Mr. Constantine, your entity seeks something far more valuable than another puppet." His gaze fixed on Nora with predatory intensity. "Miss Thorne's bloodline carries the capacity to choose, to accept or reject supernatural influence through conscious decision rather than coercion. Imagine the legitimacy such willing cooperation would provide to our cause." The industrial complex seemed to contract around them as the full scope of Greystone's plan became clear. "He doesn't want to corrupt me. He wants to convert me, make me a willing participant in whatever he's been building." "And if I refuse?" Nora asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the way Marcus kept glancing toward the exit routes that were undoubtedly already sealed. The entity that spoke through Greystone's mouth wore his face like an ill-fitting mask, the familiar features distorting with expressions that belonged to something far older and infinitely more alien than any wolf consciousness. When it smiled, Nora could see the shadows moving wrong behind its eyes, as if the darkness itself had learned to hunger and dream and scheme across centuries of patient manipulation. "Refusal, little tracker, carries consequences that extend far beyond your personal fate," the thing said, gesturing toward screens that had descended from the industrial ceiling. The images they displayed made Nora's blood freeze. Derek and the remaining pack members locked in cages that hummed with electrical energy. Sarah Constantine chained in what looked like a ritual chamber, and dozens of other wolves from territories across the region, all imprisoned in similar facilities. "Your choice affects not just your own future, but the survival of everyone you've ever claimed to protect." Jackson's growl carried harmonics that spoke to alpha fury pushed beyond rational control. "You're holding hostages to force cooperation. That's not conversion. That's coercion dressed up in philosophical bullshit. His hands had shifted to claws without conscious thought, his wolf rising to meet a threat that conventional weapons couldn't touch. What do you really want? What's the end game here? The entity's laughter echoed from speakers throughout the complex, creating a surround sound effect that made reality itself seem to vibrate with malevolent amusement. The endgame, young alpha, is evolution. The current pack structure is chaotic, inefficient, weakened by individual will and emotional attachment. I offer unity of purpose, clarity of vision, the kind of collective consciousness that built empires when your ancestors were still hiding in caves. Nora felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear, but a cold fury that tasted like silver and smelled like thunderstorms. Evolution. It's calling the systematic destruction of free will evolution. You're talking about slavery, she said, her voice carrying a resonance she didn't recognize, something that made the corrupted wolves flanking Greystone flinch as if struck. You want to turn every wolf into a puppet dancing to your tune, and you're calling it progress. I offer purpose beyond the limitations of individual consciousness, the entity replied. But for the first time, its confidence seemed fractured by something approaching uncertainty. Your bloodline carries the genetic memory of the original compact, Miss Thorne. You can feel the truth of what I offer, the peace that comes from absolute certainty, the strength that flows from unified action. The pressure against Nora's mind was subtle at first, then increasingly insistent. Whispers that promised an end to doubt, to loneliness, to the crushing weight of making choices that affected others' lives. For a moment, she could see the appeal. No more responsibility, no more guilt, no more fear of making the wrong decision. Just simplicity, and the death of everything that makes us who we are. Show her what cooperation brings, the entity commanded, and the screens shifted to display images of territories where its influence had already taken hold. Wolves moving in perfect synchronization, their faces empty of individual expression but radiating collective contentment. No conflict, no dissent, no messy complications of personal relationships or competing loyalties. This is what I offer: peace through unity, strength through submission. Jackson moved closer to her, his scent carrying layers of desperation and determination that cut through the entity's psychic pressure like a blade through silk. Nora, he whispered, his voice rough with emotions he'd never learned to express. Whatever you're seeing, whatever it's showing you, remember that choosing to fight is what makes us who we are. The struggle is what gives meaning to the victory. The words hit her like a physical anchor, pulling her back from the edge of a decision that would have unmade everything she'd ever believed about the value of individual choice. He's right. The entity isn't offering peace. It's offering the absence of life itself. I have an answer for you, she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even her. The moment Nora spoke her refusal, the industrial complex erupted into chaos that transcended physical violence and entered realms where reality itself became a battlefield. The entity's fury manifested as pressure waves that shattered windows and buckled metal, while the corrupted wolves moved with inhuman speed toward their primary targets. But something else was happening, something the entity hadn't anticipated. I reject your offer, Nora said, and her words carried power that made the air itself ring like struck metal. I reject your vision of unity through slavery, your peace through the death of choice, your strength through the surrender of will. With each declaration, light began emanating from her skin, not the harsh glow of artificial illumination, but something warm and silver that seemed to come from within her bones themselves. The entity recoiled as if struck, Greystone's commandeered features contorting with rage and something that might have been fear. You don't understand the forces you're invoking, little tracker. The bloodline gifts come with prices that your ancestors paid in blood and madness. You cannot wield such power without consequence. But Nora was beyond listening to warnings, beyond fear of consequences. The silver light intensified as genetic memories surfaced, images of the first wolves who had made pacts with forces beyond mortal understanding, who had accepted supernatural enhancement in exchange for the responsibility to police the boundaries between worlds. That's what we were originally, not just pack hunters, guardians. Protectors of the balance between human and supernatural realms. Jackson fought beside her with the fluid lethality of an alpha defending his mate, his claws finding purchase in corrupted flesh, while his movements created space for her to work whatever power was building in her chest like a silver storm. "Whatever you're doing, Nora, do it faster!" he shouted over the sound of supernatural combat. "I can't hold them off much longer." The power reached critical mass with the sound of reality tearing, and suddenly Nora could see the entity's true form, not the grandfatherly facade it wore through Greystone, but something vast and writhing that existed partially in their dimension and partially in spaces between spaces. It's not from here. It's something that slipped through cracks in the world, something that learned to feed on conscious will and grew stronger with each mind it consumed. "You think your little light show can banish something that has fed for millennia?" The entity snarled, its voice now coming from multiple sources as it abandoned any pretense of humanity. "I have consumed the will of thousands, absorbed their strength, made their loyalty into armor against exactly the kind of resistance you represent." Nora smiled, and the expression felt alien on her face. Not cruel, but carrying the weight of genetic memory that stretched back to the dawn of supernatural civilization. "You're right," she said, her voice echoing with harmonics that belonged to every ancestor who had carried the guardian bloodline. "My power alone isn't enough to banish you, but I'm not alone." She reached out mentally, touching the minds of every corrupted wolf in the complex, feeling past their artificial loyalty to the spark of individual consciousness that the entity had buried, but never quite extinguished. "Choose," she whispered into their minds, her power offering what the entity never could, the return of individual will, complete with all its messy complications and terrifying responsibilities. "Choose to be yourselves again, whatever the cost." The response was immediate and devastating to the entity's control structure. One by one, the corrupted wolves began remembering who they had been before supernatural influence rewrote their personalities, and with that remembering came rejection of the false unity that had defined their existence. The screaming began as the first corrupted wolf remembered his name, Thomas Brackwater, father of 3, loyal enforcer who had disappeared during a routine patrol 6 months ago and returned as something hollow-eyed and obedient. The sound that tore from his throat carried 40 years of suppressed anguish as artificial loyalty shattered like glass under the pressure of reclaimed identity. Nora felt each awakening like a physical blow, the pain of minds reasserting individuality flooding through her connection to the guardian bloodline. The entity didn't just steal their will, it fed them pain and called it peace, taught them to crave the absence of choice because choice hurt too much. Her silver light pulsed with each liberation, growing stronger as more wolves broke free from supernatural influence. The entity's form began destabilizing as its primary source of power, the collective will of the corrupted, transformed from fuel into resistance. "You don't understand what you're destroying," it shrieked through Greystone's increasingly distorted features. "They chose submission. They begged for the peace I offered when the weight of individual consciousness became too much to bear. They chose survival," Nora replied, her voice carrying the weight of ancestral authority. "You offered them the choice between slavery and death, then called their decision freedom." Around them, the industrial complex shuddered as reality reasserted normal physics, and the supernatural pressure that had been holding the building's damaged structure together began to fail. Jackson appeared at her side, blood streaming from claw marks but his eyes blazing with something fiercer than mere alpha authority. "The hostages," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and determination. "If this place comes down, they're all dead." His hand found hers, and the contact sent power coursing between them in ways that transcended simple touch. Mate bond recognizing mate bond. 2 supernatural bloodlines creating something stronger than either could achieve alone. The realization hit Nora like lightning. We're not just mates. We're complementary powers, guardian and alpha, protection and leadership. 2 halves of something the original packs were built around. "The hostages are the key," she said, understanding crystallizing as the entity's form continued to dissolve. "It's been using their fear and desperation to anchor itself in this reality. If we can free them, cut off that emotional food source." Working together, they pushed their combined power outward, following the psychic threads that connected the entity to its prisoners. The rescue wasn't physical. They couldn't teleport through space, but they could offer something more valuable, the knowledge that they weren't forgotten, that someone was fighting for their freedom, that their individual worth hadn't been forgotten in the calculations of political necessity. Derek's voice reached them first, weak, but unmistakably carrying alpha authority despite imprisonment. "Nora? How is this possible?" The confusion in his mental voice spoke to genuine bewilderment rather than performative surprise. He really didn't know. Greystone played him as thoroughly as he played everyone else. "We're coming for you," Nora replied, her power carrying reassurance across impossible distances. "All of you. Hold on just a little longer." But even as she spoke, she could feel the entity gathering its remaining strength for one final assault. Not against her power, but against the building itself. If it can't win, it's going to try to take everyone down with it. The industrial complex groaned like a living thing in pain as support beams began failing under supernatural pressure. They had minutes, maybe less, before the entire structure came down on top of them and buried the truth along with everyone who had fought to uncover it. The entity's final gambit wasn't destruction. It was revelation. And the truth it spoke as the industrial complex crumbled around them hit harder than any physical blow. "You think you're saving them?" It laughed through Greystone's collapsing form, its voice fracturing into harmonics that belonged to every wolf it had ever consumed. "Look deeper, little guardian. See what your precious ancestors really were." The psychic assault that followed wasn't aimed at Nora's mind, but at her genetic memory, forcing her to witness scenes from the bloodline's origins that she'd never been meant to see. The first guardians hadn't been noble protectors. They'd been weapons, created by entities like the one she was fighting, designed to enforce supernatural law through violence that made modern pack politics seem gentle by comparison. "We were monsters," she whispered, the words torn from her throat, as ancestral memories flooded her consciousness. The guardian bloodline wasn't created to protect people. It was created to control them, to make sure supernatural beings stayed in line through fear of what would happen if they didn't. The silver light emanating from her skin flickered as doubt ate at the foundation of her power. Jackson's hand tightened on hers, his alpha presence pushing back against the entity's psychological warfare. "Maybe they were monsters," he said, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite the chaos around them. "But you're not them. You chose differently. You chose to protect instead of control, to offer freedom instead of demanding submission." His eyes met hers, and she saw reflected there the truth she'd been afraid to acknowledge. The bloodline doesn't define what you do with the power. You do. The entity's laughter took on a desperate edge, as its form continued to destabilize. "Sentiment won't save you when the real powers learn what you've done here. I was just an advanced scout, little guardian. There are things in the spaces between worlds that make me look like a beloved pet." Even as it spoke, its substance was being drawn back toward whatever dimensional crack it had originally emerged from. "Then we'll face them when they come," Nora replied, her power stabilizing as she accepted both the dark history of her bloodline and her choice to forge a different path, together. The word carried weight that transcended simple cooperation. It was a promise, a commitment, a recognition of the mate bond that had been building between them since their first meeting. Around them, the corrupted wolves were helping each other toward the exits, their movements unsteady, but unmistakably individual, as they rediscovered personal agency after months or years of supernatural control. Marcus supported Thomas Brackwater, both men's faces showing the hollow exhaustion that came after trauma, but also something that might eventually grow into hope. The building's final collapse began with a sound like the world breaking, but by then, they were already moving, not just running for the exits, but using their combined power to create a protective bubble around the evacuating wolves. The Guardian bloodline's true purpose wasn't control or destruction, Nora realized, but exactly what she was doing now, using power to give others the space they needed to choose their own paths. "The hostages?" Jackson asked as they reached the perimeter, his voice tight with concern for people who were more than political pawns. They were pack, family, the foundation of everything worth protecting. Nora extended her senses, following the psychic threads to their sources, and smiled, despite their desperate circumstances. Alive, shaken but alive. The entity's connection to them severed when it lost cohesion. She paused, feeling something else in the distance, multiple somethings. And heading this way fast. Derek's bringing the cavalry. The reunion between Derek and his pack took place in the ruins of the industrial complex, surrounded by evidence of supernatural manipulation that made 40 years of political decisions suddenly make terrible sense. The alpha who had banished Nora with such conviction now stood before her with the hollow expression of a man whose entire worldview had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt around lies. "I destroyed you for nothing," Derek said, his voice carrying the weight of guilt that would probably never fully fade. 40 years of trusting Greystone's counsel. 40 years of making decisions based on information designed to serve something that saw us all as resources to be harvested. His hand shook as he spoke, alpha authority wavering under the pressure of confronting his own complicity in the conspiracy. Nora felt the temptation to make him suffer, to let him carry the full weight of guilt for her banishment and the pack's suffering. But as she looked at him, really looked, with senses enhanced by her awakened bloodline, she could see the psychic scars left by decades of subtle manipulation. Greystone didn't just lie to him. He used supernatural influence to make Derek more susceptible to suggestions, more likely to act on anger instead of investigating inconsistencies. "You were a victim too," she said, the words carrying forgiveness that surprised them both. Greystone spent decades learning exactly which psychological pressure points would make you react the way he needed. You never had a fair chance to see through his manipulation. The admission didn't erase the pain of her banishment, but it transformed it from personal betrayal into systematic tragedy. Jackson moved to stand beside her, his presence both protective and supportive, as the pack dynamics shifted around them. "The question now is what we do with the knowledge we've gained. How many other territories are still under entity influence? How many other alphas are making decisions based on corrupted information?" His tone carried the practical concern of a leader thinking beyond immediate circumstances. The answer came from an unexpected source. Lydia, emerging from the group of rescued hostages with her face showing the exhaustion that came after breaking free from supernatural control. "7 territories that I know of for certain," she said, her voice rough with shame and determination. "Greystone, the entity. It had me documenting pack structures across the region, identifying key individuals for either corruption or elimination." The sight of her former best friend hit Nora with complicated emotions. Grief for the friendship that had been corrupted, anger at the betrayal, but also sympathy for someone who had been trapped in an impossible situation. "How long?" she asked, needing to understand the scope of Lydia's involvement. "How long were you working for it willingly before the supernatural influence took hold?" 3 months, Lydia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "My brother was dying, needed treatment we couldn't afford. Greystone offered to pay for everything in exchange for small favors, information about pack security, observations about individual wolves' capabilities." Her voice broke as she continued. "By the time I realized what I was really doing, the entity had hooks in my mind that made refusal impossible. I tried to warn you, tried to leave clues you might recognize, but the corruption made you more effective at betrayal than resistance," Nora finished, understanding the cruel psychology of the entity's control methods. "It didn't just steal your will. It inverted it, made you better at serving its purposes than you ever could have been while fighting it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of vehicles from multiple territories, alphas who had received Derek's emergency communications and come to investigate reports of supernatural interference in pack politics. The sight of the collapsed complex and the rescued hostages would require explanations that challenged everything the supernatural community thought it knew about pack independence and territorial sovereignty. "We're going to need a new structure," Derek said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a leader facing the necessity of rebuilding everything from the ground up. "New protocols for detecting supernatural influence, new methods for verifying information, new alliances between territories that have been artificially set against each other." Nora nodded, her hand finding Jackson's as she considered the scope of what lay ahead. "And new guardians." The bloodline was corrupted by its original purpose, but that doesn't mean it can't be redeemed. She looked around at the assembled wolves, freed hostages, former enemies, pack members whose loyalty had been tested and proven genuine. "We have a chance to build something better than what came before, something based on choice instead of coercion, cooperation instead of control." The mate bond that had been building between her and Jackson crystallized in that moment, not as supernatural compulsion, but as conscious choice. 2 people who had found each other in the midst of conspiracy and chosen to face whatever came next together. "Partners?" he asked, and the word carried implications that went far beyond romance. "Partners," she confirmed, and felt the silver light of her awakened bloodline pulse in harmony with his alpha presence. Around them, wolves from multiple territories began the difficult work of rebuilding trust that had been systematically undermined for 40 years. The entity was gone, but its legacy would take time to fully overcome. There would be other threats, other challenges to the fragile peace they were trying to build. But for the first time since her banishment began, Nora felt genuine hope that the future might be worth the struggles required to reach it. 6 months later, the first interterritorial council meeting in over a century convenes under joint leadership. Nora and Jackson have established a new Guardian Academy, training wolves with enhanced abilities to detect and resist supernatural influence. The scars left by decades of manipulation are healing slowly, but the bonds forged in crisis have proven stronger than the divisions that were artificially created. And in the spaces between worlds, other entities watch and wait, but now they face a supernatural community that knows they exist and has learned to fight back.